I was messing around with my mic settings, so maybe it'll sound a little bit better on the stream. Not like when I'm talking, but when I'm not talking, maybe I won't have to mute it every time. I took I think it was the noise floor up, so it doesn't pick up everything.
Cool. All right, testing Twitch 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Testing Twitch 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Yeah, you sound good.
Okay.
Testing YouTube. Hold on.
We don't even need to do the test again.
Nope. That's funny as shit.
YouTube's just so weird because it's like the live streams too. Like you have to do the
Yeah,
2x
you do the speed up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's been there for literally years at this point.
Yeah.
You ready to get started?
Yep.
Hello and welcome to episode 172 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are continuing our conversation about the third major of the 2025 Call of Duty League season. Of course, we talked about the first part for an hour and a half yesterday evening. So if you want to go back, I would very much recommend doing so and listen to that conversation. I think we had a pretty good conversation about a lot of things in relation to Major 3, but we're going to continue that conversation. And we do have some additional information out of the OpTic Texas camp. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Doing all right. Back-to-back days for an Ego Chall. I think it's probably the first time we've ever done that, but we both got stuff going on this week and want to make sure we get at least cover our bases with the rest of the major stuff and preview these matches that are coming up this weekend are ready to kick off the Major 4 qualifiers. So, yeah, ready to go.
Before we get into the actual teams that we had planned to discuss today, we should talk about OpTic Texas because we talked about them yesterday, and we don't necessarily want to double up, but I think considering OpTic is the most popular team in the league, and there's been so much anticipation or maybe a desire from the Green Wall for this roster change to happen, I think it should be noted at the top. Shotzzy was on his stream today, and he was asked a bunch of questions, obviously, about what's going to happen with the OpTic Texas roster. We even discussed yesterday about how Mercules might be a potential target for OpTic going into the Major 4 qualifiers, which, of course, start later this week, so there's not a traditional break in between the Major and the qualifiers. But Shotzzy said that we're not switching. That was his exact quote, and I don't know. I'm inclined to believe him. I don't think that's something that he would necessarily lie about, but also it is a sticky situation because he's in a position where if he says if he doesn't say anything, if he declines to even answer that question, then there is speculation that it's going to happen. Obviously, if he says it's not going to happen, there's going to be backlash, which there has been from the OpTic Texas fans about, obviously this team is in 8th place in the CDL standings, very much in danger of not even making it to champs after winning champs a year ago. What do you make of all of this? Shotzzy saying, hey, we're not going to switch up our roster now.
Yeah, I think Benji Nassim had probably the most logical reaction to this clip. It is worth mentioning, I just based on like the tone of Shotzi's voice and everything in this clip, I mean it's only like a 10-second clip, so it's hard to really gather any information from that limited amount of time there that the clip is running, but it doesn't seem like he's joking. It seems like he's probably like, a little annoyed that his chat most likely right as he's going live for the first time after the tournament, is probably flooded with questions and all that. He's probably just like, just wants to address it, get it done and over with, move on. But Benjay did point out, he retweeted Crone's tweet of the Shotzzy clip and said, one, plenty of pros have lied, spread misinfo on social Twitch about changes to not tip their hand for what it's worth. Two, T8 in back-to-back events and sticking, if happening, is not going to be a popular decision. It's actually back-to-back-to-back events, top 8.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that's like,
Way up.
it wouldn't surprise me if something comes out over these next couple of days where OpTic does decide to make a change, because that's just been like the guessing game with OpTic this year, at least from my perspective, is I really thought they were going to stick even when they were struggling during the Major 2 qualifiers with the champs winning roster from last year. I was off on that. I didn't think even before that, after Major 1 they were going to go back to Pred in favor of Hook, when it looked like Hook was the best player on the team for that like little stint to start the year. So and obviously they did go back to Pred. So that I've been off in reading the OpTic roster situation for most of this year. So I think whatever I'm gonna say, the opposite might very well happen, and that's what I'm feeling right now. That if Shotzzy says they are sticking, that I believe him. It felt like when the stuff came out about Kenny, like quote unquote stepping down and all that. They bring in Skies as like a vibes guy for the team. It felt like then that they were planning on using this roster for the rest of the year. Shotzzy says here that they aren't making a change, so I'm inclined to believe him, but we will have to wait and see. Again, they play on Saturday, and said it yesterday. They don't technically have to make a change before that match on Saturday. They could make a mid qualifier change. I definitely disagree with that decision. I either think you make a change before these qualifiers, or you just stick it out and ride it out with the current team. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see. I do think the whole, like you said at the top of the show, we went into details yesterday about Mercules and all that, and gave a bunch of possible angles to what his situation is. Is he going to stick with Toronto as a sub? Is he going to stick in Toronto's roster, and Bean's going to be moved to the bench just because of potential recurring visa issues if those can't be resolved? Or is Mercury's going to get an offer from another team? Felt like one of those other teams that he could potentially get an offer from would be OpTic, because it felt like, just based on what we saw from Mercury's this past event, he could fill in for Skies on this team and play that little flex role and do a good job at it, because we saw him do pretty well this past weekend with in a dire situation where he had limited practice, if no practice at that. So yeah, I mean, obviously, if OpTic decides to stick, they're what's the saying? They're making their own bed or making their own grave, and they got to lay in it, or whatever the saying is. Like that's going to be their decision. They got to deal with it if the rest of the way, if things don't improve. But like Benjay said at the end of this tweet, they've had 3 different rosters for the 3 majors, and each major has resulted in a top 8 finish. So the little tweaks to the roster haven't made a big change in terms of OpTic's placing yet, but who knows? I guess, looking at this literally a year ago, OpTic had a terrible placing in Major 4. I don't remember how they did in the Major 4 qualifiers.
I think was it not that they lost like all but one of their qualifiers and then got double first rounded, I think?
Maybe. I mean, I know they did bad at the LAN. I just can't remember the qualifiers leading up to that. But regardless, they obviously responded to that by winning champs. So maybe that's the thought process here. Like you can't do worse than you did at the last major last year. And then you built off of that and went on to win champs. So we'll have to see how it works out for the Green Wall.
Yeah, so they went the Major Four qualifiers last season. They tied for last place. They were 1-6.
Sheesh.
I think they lost like a bunch of game fives, which was kind of like their thing at the time, and then I'm pretty sure they got double first rounded in Major Four, and then or I guess not double first rounded, just first rounded by Miami, and then they went on to win champs. So I mean. They probably can talk themselves into that, I guess, delude themselves that this is just, or, if we did it last year, we can do it this year. The difference is that you had Kenny last year, you had Pred last year. This team is not as talented as the one you had a year ago, and you haven't shown any kind of proof at all this season that this is a championship level roster other than the Major One qualifiers. That's the only time that this team has looked remotely competitive against the top teams. So I would just say if they were to think that, and I don't necessarily think they are, I would just say that that's not the case. You guys are not anywhere close to where you were back in 2024. I think I made my case for why they should make the roster change yesterday. I'm not going to really repeat that, but I can understand the idea behind not making this change, especially when you already have the qualifiers coming up this weekend instead of next weekend. You think maybe you can get a little farther ahead with this current roster, just continuing to practice versus making this change and kind of starting from scratch or somewhere near scratch. But still, like, this team is really on the bubble, and this could be, this will be a make or break, right? Like, if they don't make this change and they don't make champs, I mean, Karma gets so much shit about it. Shotzzy, Dashy, those guys get it. Hex gets it. Maybe Scump even gets it. I don't know. Maybe get some residual hate. And Methods and Imbos, they all get the hate because OpTic did not make champs. And they're blamed for whatever reason. But yeah, this is a really bad situation that they're in. And I was just looking at their qualifier schedule. They have a real good shot of starting 0-3 in these qualifiers. And you were talking about how they could theoretically make a mid-qualifier roster change. And I think if they do start 0-3, I could see that happening. Just the panic of, oh my God, like, especially if Minnesota wins like 2 of their first 3 matches, it really might come down to we need to just win 1 or 2 more matches this season, and we're not confident that this roster can do that. Obviously, that's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts, but certainly OpTic has not performed close enough to where you could have any sort of confidence that they could win even 2 matches. I don't think you can have a ton of confidence that they can win 2 of 5 qualifying matches. So they're in a really bad spot. I disagree with the decision if they're not going to make a change, but like Ben said, maybe it's just lying. Like, maybe Shotzzy just got on there and was just like, I'm just going to say we're not making a change, and then we'll announce it on Thursday or Friday afternoon, and then people can kind of do with that what they will. But yeah, they're I have no idea. This OpTic season has been one for the history books. I was certainly not expecting that either. The next thing we want to talk about, I guess it's not a topic, but I just thought it was interesting, and it was something that I pointed out to you right after we got off stream last night, was that Breaking Point had kind of created their own version of the triangle that you specifically mentioned yesterday on the podcast, and you were talking about how FaZe has been able to beat LAT, and LAT has beaten Vancouver. Vancouver's beaten Atlanta FaZe, and Breaking Point put a rock, paper, scissors graphic on their social media, and LAT is 5-0 against Vancouver. Vancouver's 3-2 against FaZe, and FaZe is 3-1 against LAT. And I think that is a very good illustration of where we're at this point in the season. We have 3 teams above the rest, and then I would say there's Toronto, and then probably Carolina. Like, I don't know if they would necessarily be grouped together. Yeah, and then Miami probably. But then it seems like a pretty big gap between that. But, it definitely, we have a definitive top 3, where in the past, like you've mentioned, we had a top 4 or sometimes even a top 5, like where we felt like even the 5th place team could get up there. And I guess this season, if Carolina could ever beat LAT, then we could talk ourselves into that kind of idea. But yeah, we have 3 top teams, and they're all able to kind of beat one another at certain points. And I think that's going to be an interesting way to finish this season. And yeah, so let's talk about FaZe, because that's probably the way to jump off this, unless you have anything else.
I was just gonna say, based on like as a general reminder, like this isn't the biggest difference here is especially not even changing from last year to this year, where it's like a 4-team race to a 3-team race this year. But it's changed from the beginning of this season, because at the start of this season, it felt like it was the 3 teams were going to be FaZe, LAT, and OpTic.
Yeah, sure.
And it's just OpTic didn't live up to that regard yet. And obviously there have been a multitude of reasons as to why that has happened. But at this point, it is like coming into the season, we thought it was going to be like a top 3 or a triangle as we have here. It's just Vancouver has replaced OpTic, and I think that goes back to our conversation last night of the immediate impact Neptune has had since joining the Vancouver roster. And I think we went pretty in depth with that last night, so I'm not going to repeat it here. And if you guys want to hear us talk more about that, go back and listen to yesterday's episode 171.
Well, that's kind of like just roster changes in general. Like some roster changes look kind of great on paper. Like bringing in Hook for OpTic was kind of a big win, obviously, because people are saying, "Oh, Hook's going to be really good. He's like one of the top players in this game." And OpTic brings him in, and he does have an immediate impact. They're able to, I think, sweep the rest of their qualifying matches. And they did look, I think they were the number 1 seed going into Major 1, and then it fell apart at Major 1, and then they made another roster change, and then it spiraled out of control at that point. Where Vancouver, they made one roster change. They made a definitive change. They stuck to it, and it has worked out perfectly for them. And they had other options, of course, at that time, where we were talking about how they might, even Hook was potentially an option, because we didn't know what he was going to do, and obviously he waited out to go back to OpTic. But it all kind of worked out, and that's just kind of the funny thing about roster changes. They might not always look the best. Nobody thought that Neptune coming into this roster for Vancouver was going to be this game-changing change, but it turned out to be the best roster change in recent history. Like, I can't remember one that has had such a big impact like this, taking a bottom-tier team to a top 3 team within a few weeks, because they were already beating FaZe and kind of competing with LAT. So I can't remember a time that's really happened. But yeah, roster changes are funny.
Yeah, and the only thing, we can move on after this, but I will just, this is a good thing because we didn't talk about it. Last episode is the other option. We, at that time when Vancouver decided it was going to move on from Hixie, the initial report was Neptune and Afro. Then the Hook stuff with Pred coming back in came after that. But just want to take this opportunity to shout out Afro, because he was on that Team Notorious squad that just won the Challengers component of Major 3. I'm trying to get the rest of the squad. I know Eric Boom was on the team too. I believe
Rafi was on the team.
Yeah, Rafi, and I can't remember the 4th, but I can't find the Challengers section for. Here it is. F dot. So Afro, Eric Boom, F dot, Rafi, and Josh, if anyone remembers, B Sport Josh from the old school Splice team for the EU guys. He's the coach of the squad. So shout out Afro and shout out those boys for taking care of business in Challengers this weekend.
Yeah, of course. All European team, I believe, winning Challengers final, or not Challengers final, Challengers Open. And I believe there's one Challengers Open left, and then we go to Challengers Finals, which is coinciding with Champs, if I'm not mistaken. But I did want to talk about FaZe, because that was the team that, the most notable team that we did not get to discuss yesterday on the pod. But obviously, this is a big story. The fact that they had, a very disappointing result at Major 3. They had won Major 1. They had won Major 2. Previously, they had won EWC at the very end of not last CDL season, but after last CDL season. So they had won the three biggest events in a row, and they were looking to win four in a row, win the third straight major, which certainly had never happened in CDL history, and they just did not have it this weekend. This is I can't say it's like a horrendous performance because it is losing to Vancouver in the first round, which Vancouver, of course, goes to the grand finals. They go to game 5 with LAT in the winter finals. And we've talked about it. They're one of the top 3 teams in the league. So it's, really there's no shame, I guess, in that. It was surprising, or more surprising, that they ended up losing to the Miami Heretics, which was, obviously this is Miami's home major, technically, I think. It was technically their home major, and they've looked really good since bringing in Super. Certainly a much improved team, and a team that has caused kind of a bit of havoc, to be honest. In these qualifiers, they were tied for the number 1 seed in the qualifiers. That being said, I still think FaZe should beat the Miami Heretics, even with how good that team has been recently. And to do it in, I believe it was losers semis, losers quarterfinals. And, it's a bad performance from FaZe. I don't know if there's anything to really kind of say about like the individual performances. I don't know what you noticed from FaZe, but how do you kind of view Atlanta FaZe's showing at Major 3 now that we're a day removed from Championship Sunday?
So I will say the one thing that I think, might be surprising to some people who aren't, like following every single match or anything like that is like, Miami did beat Atlanta in the qualifiers before this tournament. And we talked about Atlanta struggling in hard points in these qualifiers. Atlanta won vault hard point 250 to 218, and then lost maps 2, 3, and 4 to Miami in the qualifiers. So Atlanta beat them on vault, and in this matchup at Major 3 itself on land, Miami won vault hardpoint map 250 to 115. And we did an exclusive dive, or not exclusive, but a deep dive into the Abizi stats in hardpoint during the Major 3 qualifiers that the CDL broadcast posted. That beat down by Miami in map 1 on vault, everyone on Miami was positive, everyone on Atlanta was negative. So it wasn't a case of just like, Abizi struggling a little bit and that leading to some hard point woes. Like they got outslayed and they got dominated. And then the second hard point was Hacienda hard point. They lose at 250 to 160, and they didn't play that the other matchup in the qualifiers. But Karma on the Scump watch party was saying that he doesn't think FaZe are like that good of a Hacienda team. And he said, I believe FaZe beat OpTic on Hacienda when they played. I'm scrolling down to find it now. No, OpTic beat Atlanta on Hacienda. So I don't remember what I think maybe it was another time they matched up. I don't know. But basically Karma was like alluding to like, so in that Miami match, he was like, I think if it gets to map 4, Miami's going to win it because I just don't think Atlanta are that good at Hacienda hardpoint. And one thing he was pointing out on that map, and I felt like if he was willing to say this on the watch party, that this has to be something that other teams, or I guess maybe not everybody would know it, but I feel like if he was like willing to say this, then it's not that big of a deal because like if it's something he just noticed and wanted to share with OpTic to give them a better chance or a leg up against FaZe going forward, like he would have just internalized it. But one thing he mentioned, the garage hill on Hacienda, he was saying that like he feels like FaZe are one of the teams that don't like to wrap around the back of that, and they like to just keep hitting the front or the side door. And he was like, teams like Atlanta, LAT, and Vancouver, they do like to challenge the back and wrap all the way around. And Karma was pointing that out during the watch party. And I was kind of surprised he was like saying that. So that made me think like, okay, if he's, seeing this in the match and he's willing to share it to, everybody watching the Scump watch party, then it's not like breaking news or anything like that, or, some super big secret. But if it's something other teams are doing and FaZe aren't doing it, maybe that's like carries over to other maps, and there are other tendencies that FaZe could change or improve upon that could help them going forward towards the end of the season here. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, and end of the day, definitely a disappointing performance from Atlanta, all things considered, because just like you said yesterday, like when you got 2 first places and you don't get first place the third time, anything besides first is obviously worse than what you did earlier this year. But just the way it happened, really, for Atlanta, like losing to 2 of the teams that make it to Championship Sunday, like, it's not like they got double first rounded or something like that. Like they were able to pick up 2 3-0 wins over Cloud9 and OpTic before losing to Miami. So I did think that that's another thing I noticed too, is like technically FaZe and Boston have the same placing, but because Boston won in the winners bracket, FaZe played one more series, and Boston's map count at this event would be 5 and 6, whereas Atlanta's would be, well, they won 6 maps just in the 2 3-0s. So that's 6-0, 7, 3, 9, 6. Yeah, so they got a better map count, played more series, but had the same placing as Boston, which is just, that's the way the cookie crumbles when one team loses first round and the other doesn't. But yeah, I do think, we still have to keep an eye on FaZe's hard point against some of these strong teams. I did think in the first the winners bracket matchup against Vancouver, it definitely started out the opposite of how I expected. I was expecting Vancouver to take map 1 and then FaZe to take the search. I think that's kind of like, I extensively went over that in our preview show. I was like, if maybe Atlanta can take the hard point to start the series, then maybe they have a leg up in the series. But if Vancouver can take the search, maybe they have a leg up in the series. And then both of those happen, and I'm just sitting here like, well, okay, I guess I thought it was going to be 1-1 after the 2 maps, and we got here. It's just a different way of happening. But then, once they play Hacienda again against Vancouver in that series, and they lost at 250 to 133. So I don't know, maybe if Hacienda is going to be an issue for Atlanta, they played it against Cloud9. They won 250 to 164. Oh, it must be here. Yeah, they played it against OpTic and they won 250 to 161. So they lost it Hacienda Hardpoint in the qualifiers. Or OpTic beat FaZe 250 to 143. Map 1 Hacienda Hardpoint in the qualifiers, but then FaZe beat them 250 161 on Hacienda Hardpoint at the major. So that is interesting, because that means Atlanta played Hacienda in every series. Hacienda Hardpoint, that is. They played in every single series at this major. So obviously, it could be a case of just teams really like that map, or maybe it's just a case of Atlanta thinks they are better at that map, and it just hasn't been going their way lately. So, but then saying that, they obviously have a 2-2 record on the tournament, because they beat Cloud9 and OpTic on it, but they lost to Vancouver and Miami. So long-winded way of saying, I do think we got to keep an eye on the hard point for Atlanta. The search is, I don't think the search was what you would expect from Atlanta necessarily, because they, Simp drops 14 and they lose to Vancouver 6-4 on red card search. They win 6-5 against Cloud9, and that's with Attach going 1-9. So that's a really close search, all things considered. Atlanta wins 6-5 red card search against OpTic, and then the Miami series, there was another 6-5 where Atlanta was down 2-5 and they made the comeback to win map 2. and they lost dealership S&D in Game 5 to Miami 6-4. So those are a lot of very close searches, whether Atlanta is losing or winning them. And obviously, we know when Atlanta is firing in all cylinders, they are a dominant search and destroy team that can 6-0, 6-1 team. So, not any like major red flags for me from the Atlanta camp. I do think it's just I feel like there have been times during seasons over the past couple of years where Atlanta goes through these little bumps in the road, for lack of a better term, and that's where this is the hurdle they're facing right now. And it feels like every year they find a way that they hit the drawing board, go back to square one, whatever saying you want to say, and they figure it out and find a way to get back to competing for championships. And that's what I expect this team to do. I do think that they got a tough set of matches this week that is going to test them immediately. And that could be concerning because, like, let's say they lose both of these qualifiers, they the community and people are going to be saying, like, what's wrong with FaZe? And this is that they're going to be very doom and gloom. And it's like, well, if you're still losing to the top teams, like, it is what it is. They just got to figure out a way to flip the script in that regard. But I do expect FaZe to they're just too talented. They got too much brain power on the coaching staff and everyone in the sports squad around them. They're going to figure it out. I believe they will. It's just going to be a matter of what they actually have to do to become that team that we saw lift 2 trophies already this year.
My biggest issue with them at this tournament was that search, because I think we talked about it a few episodes ago. The fact that FaZe coming into this event had a 90% plus win percentage in search and destroy on LAN. I think they were like 9-2 or something like that in search. And so, like, obviously they did not perform up to standard. Not to say like they're always going to keep up a 90% win percentage, but this weekend they went 3-2 in search. Obviously, like you said, they lost that first search in the series against Vancouver, the only search against Vancouver, and then they lost another one as well. And I just think, like, losing the Game 5 and stuff, like, it's just, I don't know if it's just a lull, like you were saying, like if FaZe just has these moments where they don't kind of, not that they don't show up, but they're not like the same team that they were. But I was just kind of like looking at maybe some of the disparities between online and on LAN. And I thought it was interesting because for FaZe at least, their hard point is worse on LAN. And you can say, well, they play better teams, and I think that's a good point. But at the same token, LAT's hard point win percentage improves when they get to LAN, and they're playing some of the same teams that Atlanta plays. Toronto also improves in hard point when they get to LAN. So really, I do think that there is kind of a drop-off in that particular game mode for FaZe, and that can come back to bite them, obviously, if they're playing LAT, who now has a 71% win percentage in hard point this season when they get to LAN. So, like, that's going to be really hard to overcome. Of course, Vancouver is a very good hard point team as well. They win about 60% online, and I'm sure that's way higher if we're just including the Neptune numbers, and they're about 59% when they get to LAN, which ranks third among teams. But like the S&D is still crazy, even with the drop-off this weekend. And quietly, FaZe is the the second best control team when it gets to LAN as well. They win 77% of their controls, where LAT wins 80%. So I think that's really just kind of the interesting point is they pretty much have an edge when it gets to LAN everywhere except search. Search right now, LAT is in third at 56%. Atlanta FaZe is by and far away at first place, 82% S&D win percentage. But if they lose these hard points, which was something we talked about in the online matches, they would lose game 1 and then have to fight back. If you do that consistently against these top teams, it's going to really hurt you. Of course, it didn't happen in Vancouver because they did the opposite. They started out really well and then faded. And against Miami, like, you can't lose your game fives and stuff. So I just think it's a weird situation for FaZe to be in, because of the way that they've looked on land to this point. But they're still, I think, probably the second best team. Like, I think you could argue Vancouver is better than them, just because they beat them most recently. They got a better placing on land, but I think I would still have FaZe number 2. But it is kind of surprising to see them at 2, considering they repeated the majors so far this season, before Major 3. So we'll see what happens with FaZe if they're able to kind of get out of this lull. I think their qualifying matches, it doesn't get easy. Like, it doesn't start easy, I guess, because they're going to have a really big test to start the week. And then we'll kind of see how it goes from there. This first week, I don't know if it's better for FaZe to have this week to start the qualifiers, or if it would be better for them to have it in like week 3 and try to figure it out at the very end of the online portion. I'm not entirely sure.
They've lost their first qualifier of every single
Yeah.
stage this year. I believe, ironically, I believe Major 1 and Major 3 qualifiers were both against Toronto, and obviously Major 2 qualifiers started with the Neptune debut on Vancouver, and spoiler alert, Atlanta's first qualifier match of Major 4 is against Vancouver. So definitely, I guess we'll see if they, end up going 0-4 in opening qualifier matches. But that's just a testament to the team too. Like they've obviously had their spurts this year where they've lost a couple series online and they still ended up bouncing back and winning championships. So I still believe in this team. I agree with you that I power ranking or wherever, if I had to do it number base, like 1 through 12, I would probably have Atlanta as the number 2 team. If you wanted to make the argument that Vancouver would be number 2 just because Vancouver's been beating FaZe, I wouldn't hold that against you, or I wouldn't like have a super bad reaction to that or anything. But in that case, then I feel like you still put Atlanta at worst in 3rd. So that's a testament to how good the team still is despite recent struggles.
Yeah. Are there any other teams that you wanted to talk about specifically, or is there a team next that you want to talk about?
I just want to talk about Miami. I guess we
Mhm.
can kind of loop it in because we're just talking about them playing against Atlanta. So just in general, Miami had a pretty good tournament, all things considered. Heading into this event, we were really excited for the first round matchup of Miami versus Toronto because Toronto had beat Miami in the qualifiers, and Meadows said in like a post match interview he wanted a rematch, but then obviously the Bean situation happens. We both picked Toronto to win that match. Then the Beans news comes and stuff, and we switch our pick 'em to Miami because obviously we didn't know what was gonna happen with Mercules and all that at the time. But so Miami does beat Toronto in that first matchup, and everyone's probably thinking like, yeah, that makes sense. They beat the team that's got a sub coming in, yada yada. They go on to play Thieves in winners bracket round 2. They get 3-0 swept. Um, and then they drop down the loser bracket. They beat FaZe, but then they have that rematch against Toronto, and Toronto beats them this time. And this is a Toronto team that they just, they won 3 matches before that, beating LEG, Minnesota, and Boston, and they started to play more with Mercules. And I mean, I'm not even looking at the stats for that first series between Miami and Ultra, but I wouldn't be surprised if they just, statistically had better numbers um, in that rematch later on in the tournament than literally the first match playing with an emergency sub for the very first time, or if it wasn't actually the first time of them loading into a map together, it was like one of the first times, and at most they had like a couple scrim reps or warm-up reps, whatever. So um end of the day, it is another you know top 4 placing for Miami this year, which I think if you told anybody coming into this year that Miami was going to have multiple championship Sunday appearances, they probably wouldn't have believed you. Maybe you would have had some believers, but third at major 1, fourth at major 3 now. So it is interesting that despite this being their best qualifier stage, they didn't get their best result just because they had that third place finish early this year. But I think it's undeniable at this point that this iteration of the Heretics roster just looks way better than the previous roster that did get third. And I feel like they've been playing better recently. And it's very reminiscent to last year's Heretics team when they brought in Real. I know I've said that on previous episodes, but I do think, this team continues to get more reps with Super in. Super and Rencor have been working really well together as an AR duo. I think Real obviously had his moments in this tournament where he was that Super Saiyan Real that we know and love. But I really think Metals, I feel like it was the the Atlanta series. I remember talking on the show, either recapping that Atlanta series or beforehand, and saying like everyone's talking about Super, they're talking about Super and Rencor, how they're working together. Everybody obviously talks about Real. Metals kind of felt like just like that like guy who's off to the side, or just like no one's really talking about them. And he played well in that qualifier against FaZe. And since then, I feel like he has just played very well and taken it up a notch. And I think if this squad gets it clicking, they have the ability to be a strong team, just because I feel like Super has made them a better search team. And they have that potential where it's kind of like Minnesota in a sense, where like they have the guys who can just have pop off moments in the respawn. But it's like, Real do that where he has his Super Saiyan moments and where he's just going like 40 and 20, but then he'll have other maps where Miami still wins, but he's like 30 and 35 or something. It's like, yeah, he's not, quote unquote, popping off in the KD department, but he's getting into these engagements, setting the pace for the team and all that important stuff. So, I am definitely excited to see how Miami builds off this. I think, again, like I said, very reminiscent of the team last year that once Real joined, it wasn't the immediate success like they've seen with Super. It took time for them to gel, and it ended up with them placing well at some of the tournaments towards the end of the year. I'm expecting Miami to be one of those teams. I mean, it's tough to say they'll consistently be like a championship Sunday team because, in a world where we're looking at the top 4 right now, I would say it's LAT, FaZe, Vancouver, Toronto. I guess with the uncertainty of the Beans visa situations and what Toronto's roster is going to look like, you can put Miami into like that 4th slot if you want, but they did just go 1-1 against each other at this tournament with Mercules playing in place of Beans. So, I think right now, like Miami is clear cut, like in that 5th, 6th spot in my eyes, and I think they have the potential to keep being in championship Sundays for the rest of the year if they build on this success that they found very quickly since slotting Super in.
So before Super was a permanent part of this roster, Miami was 7-15. With Super, they're 6-3. So they've almost matched that entire season win total just in a month and a half or so. As far as
they only had 7 wins.
Yeah, because they did most of their damage at the first major, and I think they only won like 1 or 2 matches in the major 2 qualifiers after that.
But they had to have. That just feels, because like you think they got 3rd place at major 1, like you have to, let's just look at. I mean, I guess it's different if you just drop down from the winners bracket round 2. I feel like they would have won at least like 4 or 5 series to get a 3rd place finish at major 1, but I don't know.
I'm just going off of Krone's graphic because I looked. So they're 13-18 now, and with Super, they won 4 of their 5 qualifying matches, and then they won 2 matches at the major as well. So like that's 6 right there. I don't think this is counting like minors. I don't think.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of that.
But they beat Vegas the first match, and then they beat Cloud9 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, so they only won 7 matches.
They were 2-5 in the Major 1 qualifiers.
Yeah, and it was just
but they got that 8th seed and
Yeah,
beat
that's
OpTic.
And that's kind of helped carry them to this point. And now, like, they're in a position where they're in 6th place in the league. They're just ahead of the Boston Breach, who's in 7th. But like they're not locked into champs. I should say that, but like they're very likely to make champs. Like they'd have to have an all-time collapse down the stretch, and then someone like Minnesota or C9 really make a run to knock them out, because OpTic is the one that's really in danger. Boston and Miami really aren't. And I think the top 4, maybe even the top 5 have clinched spots at champs. I don't know if Carolina has, but I'm almost positive LAT, Atlanta, Toronto, and Vancouver have all secured spots at champs. It's just about seeding now, and we'll see how that works out. And maybe Carolina also clinched a spot because they're 95 points ahead of Minnesota, and the most you can get. No, technically, I think they could probably jump down. But, either way, Miami has had this kind of amazing turnaround with Super. And I was looking at, like, the actual game modes. So they've actually gotten worse in Hardpoint with Super, like, in terms of win-loss, I guess. So they were 21-17 in Hardpoint before Super came into the roster, and they're 8-9 since. So you could say, okay, like, maybe they've gotten worse than that. But they have turned to a bad S&D team into a great S&D team. So they were looking at 11-20 in search before Super. Since he's come into the roster, they're 9-3, and that's including matches where they're playing against FaZe, who we just talked about. They had a 90% win percentage in search on LAN, and they beat them in a game 5 to knock them out of the tournament. Of course, they beat Toronto in the tournament as well. And people might not look in, if you look at Miami's control record with Super, it's 4-5. So you're like, all right, they're not a very good control team. They were horrendous in control before him.
Yeah.
They were 7-15. So they're about half or a little over halfway to the season total in control just in a month. So I think it really can't be overstated, his impact on this team and like how he fits into the team. And now they have a chance to get into 5th place. They're only 25 points behind Carolina for 5th place, which I don't know if you want 5th place. Like, if you're looking at the seeding, like, do you want to play potentially Vancouver, or will it be Toronto? Like, who's going to be in that 3rd, 4th spot, which I guess we could see when it comes down to the end of these qualifiers, or we get to Major 4. If some teams are like, hey, like, I don't really want to play we don't want to play Vancouver in the first round of champs. We would much rather play Toronto. I don't know if that'll play into anything, but I think it is something to just kind of keep in the back of your mind. But just getting to Miami, like, they're in 6th. They've looked incredible. They're one of the most pleasant surprises of this entire season, and I'm happy to see them thriving. And they've been able to stick to this all-Spanish roster. Of course, it didn't work out the way I think they really wanted last year. They had those roster changes. Real obviously wasn't even on the roster to begin the season. He was with Carolina, so things changed pretty rapidly for them. But I think they're getting closer to probably what their vision was all along, and that is, like, the very best Spanish players are on one team. I can't really think of, granted, I don't know a ton of Challengers players, or especially Spanish Challengers players, but I'm pretty sure that they're doing pretty nice. And obviously Eric Boom just won the Challengers Open. So, maybe he comes back into the fold next season. We'll see how that goes. But
possible.
Yeah, Vamos in the chat, they're doing great. I think I'm just going to give a shout out to my Boston Breach boys. They completely stink at times, but they're in a really good spot. And, like, I think you could really criticize them for kind of how they fall apart in some of these majors. Like, I think the last 2 or 3 majors, they've won the first match and then they lose 2 in a row. And it happened in this tournament as well. They beat OpTic Texas, as we both thought they probably would. And then they lose to Vancouver. Again, no shame in that. They lose to Toronto. Really no shame in that either, because Mercules was like kind of doing his thing at that time. Toronto went on to beat Miami in the next round. But Boston, those are really valuable CDL points. They got 30 points from this tournament for that one win against OpTic. And like, I know that I think it was Purge kind of was like, really frustrated on Twitter about doing the same thing of like winning one match and then losing two in a row. But you got to take the wins as you get them. Like, this was a team that won 5 matches, I believe, last year. They've almost tripled the win total this season. I think just to kind of illustrate it, they're literally on the verge of clinching a champ spot over the next few weeks, when they were out of contention for champs when they went into the Major 4 qualifiers. Essentially, I don't know if they were technically eliminated, but they were, in reality, eliminated from champs contention going in to the Major 4 qualifiers last season. And now they have a chance, if they win 2, 3, potentially 4 matches like they did last time, they could clinch it and not even have to really sweat at Major 4. So, I just wanted to give a shout out to my Breach boys.
I mean, just as a reminder, they came in dead last year in the CDL, and obviously this roster they're playing with now is the team they played at EWC, and they saw improvements based on that. But they went 6-27 last year, and that was last place in the CDL. So why did it went to the Major 4 standing? So that's literally, like, we were talking last year. Now, granted, this last year when we're talking about this is before the all Saudi roster for Vegas. But even Gorilla's mate this year, Gorilla mate's 4-21, and we were talking last year about Boston being one of the worst teams in CDL history. We got 2 teams this year that have not won as many CDL matches as the Boston Breach last year. And looking at Boston this year, Boston this year is 14-15. They are 5 points behind Miami, like you said, but they have the 6th best win percentage in the CDL this season. They're 14-15 is a 48%. OpTic in 8th is 15-17, which is only a 46.8%. So obviously it's only a couple percentage points there better than OpTic, but still I think that illustrates just the improvement that this team has made for Boston. And you can argue about whether Boston didn't make roster moves as a result of like financial situation for the organization and whatnot. But at the end of the day, you got to give credit to them for sticking with this roster and seeing improved results, just because there were multiple times this season where even we were saying on the podcast, like they could logically make a move if the organization was willing to. And we obviously don't know if it's a case of, they want to stick together or the organization does not want to make a move. But regardless of that, they've stuck, and it's much improved from last season. So yeah, shout out your Boston Breach.
I just have to say, because of course they had a really disappointing first major. They went in, with I think a 5-2 qualifying record. I was hyping them up. I'm like, oh my god, like look at them. They almost got their entire win total back in just the qualifiers, and then they lose in the minor. They lose double first rounded at the first major, and then they kind of have a disappointing, or I guess like, disappointing relative to what they did in the Major 1 qualifiers. They go into Major 2 and they go like 3-4, and they get first rounded in the minor. So it's like, all right, like they're kind of regressing to the mean. Since since then they've gotten 30 points at Major 3, 30 points at Major 2. They went 4-3 or 4-1, excuse me, in the Major 3 qualifiers. Like, that's all you can ask for. Like, I whether it is just them being cheap or whether this coaching staff is just like, hey, like we're just going to try to see if we can beat teams on the margins with chemistry. And I forget who said it, because I mentioned it a few weeks ago. Someone said like the team or the skill gap in the CDL this season is teamwork. And, while that's kind of like a little tongue in cheek. At the same point, like Boston has beaten these really good teams, and you could argue a part of that is just they know each other very, very well. Like they're, other than the Atlanta FaZe, they're the most tenured CDL team, right? Like I don't think anybody else has been together this long. So to me, that says like that says a lot. Like FaZe is FaZe. They have four like Hall of Fame level players, where Boston has kept this team since EWC, which is like 9 months ago, 10 months ago, and they've been able to kind of deal with like the ups and downs together. And I think that really does mean something, especially when you're really they're grinding towards champs. And I think I just want them to see it out. I want them to finish the season with this roster. I have no doubts about that at all. But I want them to kind of get to appreciate making champs together as well, because some of these guys were thrown to the side and essentially, forgotten about. Like, I don't think people really thought that Cammy was going to be back in the CDL or for a while. Like, it was probably going to be like an Arcides thing where he has to kind of play his way back in over a year or two. And Cammy just came in and he's been a pretty good player. He's been able to contribute to this team. Purge was like probably the most maligned CDL player at one point last season, and he is now a good player for the Boston Breach. So I just wanted to say that and shout out my boys. Any other teams? I think we should just mention C9, just the complete like dumpster fire right now. Like they're probably, if OpTic did not exist, because OpTic is kind of in its own realm, but if they did not exist, C9 would probably be the most disappointing team in my opinion of this season, because they're right now in 10th place. They have like a lot of work to do if they were to make champs, and I thought they were kind of like one of those top 6 teams that would like, all right, like they're probably in the middle, could compete toward the top at times, and that's just never come to fruition for them this season.
I think, if you ask me based on the start of the season, I do think most disappointing team this year, if you ask most people, it's probably OpTic, just because of the expectations for the Green Wall always. But I do think I would probably say Gorilla Mate, just because heading into this season, they had that, the reunion of the 2023 NYSL champs winning team, and that just obviously did not work. And then they've brought in some guys that were named as people in the community wanted to see. Johnny, Fellow, and Lunars back in the CDL. They were playing well in Challengers, and they brought them in, and it still hasn't been great for LAG mates. So I think I would have to say they've been a little more disappointing than Cloud9, but definitely Cloud9 is one of the more disappointing stories of this year. I do think they have to, there is somewhat of a grain of salt when saying that, because like we've said, I don't remember what episode, but it wasn't too long ago, we were saying like Cloud9 enters the CDL thinking it's going to have this, this NYSL team and thinking they're going to have Hydra. And it went from, in the offseason, for people who might not remember, Sib was initially a restricted free agent, and it was going to be like Hydra, Skies, Kismet, and then looking for one. And then everything else happens the way it happens, and it goes from Sib being a restricted free agent to Cloud9 building around Sib. And I think Sib's a great player. He's one of the straightest shooters in the league. He absolutely fries. But this season, when you think you have Hydra, and then you go from not having Hydra, that has to factor into how big of a disappointment or not a disappointment the team actually was.
Yeah, that's a good point. And they've just, like, it's just surprising to see them, like, not even in the OpTic position where they are kind of like the leader in the clubhouse. Like they have to really screw up down the stretch to not make champs. Now it's like C9 is 40 points behind OpTic, and they're, that means that they're going to have to really turn it on if they have any shot in the qualifiers in Major 4, which is obviously not the position that they want to be in, considering they've really been super inconsistent with the online matches. I think they've won They I think got top 8 at Major 1, top 6 if I'm not mistaken at Major 2, and then they get top 12 here at Major 3. And it's just like, oh man, like this is a pretty talented roster, all things considered. A lot of name value, but there's just like so little. There's so few results, I guess, for C9 this season. But what you were saying about LAG is entirely correct. They are having one of the worst seasons in CDL history, and it's sneaking under the radar, kind of like because Vegas is so bad this season that like everybody's just kind of focusing on like, wow, the Falcons have literally 1 win this season. It's like, yeah, LAG has 4. Like they have fewer wins so far this year than Boston did last year, and we spent the entire season talking about how Snoopy needs to go to challengers. And I'm not saying like it's one player in particular on LAG and it's their fault and we should limb base them or anything. But yeah, like they haven't won since the Major 2 qualifiers. They've been horrendous. They have not won a match at a major so far this season. They went 2-5 in the Major 1 qualifiers. They did not get any points in the minor. They didn't win at the Major 1. They went 1-6 in the Major 2 qualifiers. Didn't get any points at Major 2, and then obviously they went completely winless in these Major 3 qualifiers and winless at Major 3. Like that's horrendous. Like I don't know what else to say. It's really bad, and I feel bad for those players because that kind of stink does not wash off very easily. Because Boston, obviously, they kept Snoopy around, but I think he's kind of a unique example, and I don't know. Maybe Kismet will survive kind of like this really bad season, and people won't kind of hold it against him. But I do think there will be some kind of reputation that gets latched to the players that are on this team, unfortunately.
I want to go through it live real quick just because, we're talking about it like in comparison, looking at the standings.
Mm-hmm.
So LAG mates right now 4-21, Vegas Falcons 1-23. That's 11th and 12th in the standings. Comparing that to last year, Boston's the bottom at 6-27, and then 11th is Minnesota at 11-25. So Minnesota in 11th last year had almost 3 times as many wins as LAG do in the same spot in the standings right at this point. We go to 2023. LAG mates finish or LAG, not mates at that time, finish in 11th at 9-25. London came in last at 7-24. 2022 season, we got
Paris Legion, right?
Paris Legion are worst at 2-23, but second to last is Minnesota at 14-14.
Yeah.
Florida technically had the next few wins. They went 13-18, but had more CDL points, probably because of like placings or whatever.
Beating OpTic
but still
in the first round, yeah.
13 wins is second worst at that point. 2021 season, CDL page isn't loading for me. Might have to skip that.
It's probably the Paris Legion again, if I had to guess.
And 2020 season, Paris did not do terrible. I mean, they didn't do great, but they had one in that inaugural season. They had 1 second place finish at one of the home series, I remember.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure last place would have been between LAG and Seattle for the first season. But 2020 and 2021 regular season standings aren't loading for me right now. I don't know. The other ones are working, so it's not my internet, and I'm still talking, so I haven't lost internet. But point being that LAG mates right now, in terms of where they are in the standings compared to other teams at the end of the season in the same spot, they have a historically low win total.
Yeah, so 2021, LAG and Paris both had the same number of wins. They both won 8 matches that season. They were 8. LAG had the worst win percentage because they went 8-26, and Paris went 8-22, but they had the same CDL points as well. And then in 2020, Seattle and LAG tied for last place. They both won 5 matches. LAG lost 15. Seattle lost 16. We'll give it to LAG was the worst team because Seattle could only beat LAG pretty much. So the LAG Bucks were in full effect at that point, but I guess technically Seattle would have had the worst win percentage that season. But yeah, like these teams are horrendous, and like I just don't know. I think part of it is like it's a really competitive league, right? Like it's not just that these teams are bad. Like the all Saudi roster notwithstanding, that team was bad just by any standard. But like LAG at any point during this season was not like, oh my god, they're so bad. Like how do they even field this team? It's that this league is really competitive. They lost a lot of close series, and they're just not like, there is a gap obviously, but it's not so far as like the Saudi roster. That's a unique case. Like hopefully we'll never see that again, where a team is basically just putting 4 players or a combination of 4 players that should never ever be in the CDL at one time together, which is exactly what Vegas was doing. But yeah, that does it for the ranting portion of the show and talking about how bad these teams are. Real quick, I'll talk about the standings as they are right now. We've kind of covered most of it, but these are the season standings heading into the Major 4 qualifiers. First place is LAT. They have 410 CDL points. They are 20 points ahead of second place Atlanta FaZe. And then there's an 80-point gap to third place, which is the Toronto Ultra at 310 points. 10 points behind them is fourth place Vancouver Surge. Fifth place is Carolina Royal Ravens. They're 90 points behind Vancouver. And then, like I said earlier, there's a 25-point gap between Carolina in fifth and Miami in sixth. Boston is 5 points behind Miami in seventh. And OpTic, if the season ended today, would be the final team to make champs, and they would play LAT in the first round. OpTic has 145 CDL points, so they're 35 points behind Boston for 8th place. The 4 teams, again, if the season ended today, that would not make champs would be the Minnesota Rocker. They are in 9th place, 30 points behind OpTic Texas. C9 New York, they are 10 points behind Minnesota and 40 points behind OpTic in 10th place. And then LAG, of course, they have 30 CDL points so far this season. They're 115 points behind OpTic. And then the Vegas Falcons have 10 CDL points. They've won 1 match so far this season, and they are 135 points behind OpTic Texas for 8th place. So yeah, LAG and Vegas have essentially no shot at making champs. But the other 10 teams are definitely in contention. Like I said, I should just look up the COD Gamepedia, but I know that the top 4 are clinched in. And then I believe Carolina might be as well. So Carolina is not technically clinched yet, but obviously if they win 3 qualifying matches or something like that, they probably will clinch it. I think it just really depends on what Minnesota and C9 do. If they technically, I guess, if one of them were to win all 5 matches, win Major 4, then they could knock them out. But yeah, obviously Carolina probably going to make champs. Same with Miami and Boston. It's really just a question of who between OpTic, Minnesota, and C9, which of those 3 teams will make champs and likely become the 8th seed and the slaughtering lamb or whatever, the sacrificial lamb for LAT and or FaZe. So let's get into these qualifying matches. So again, just like Major 3, there are only 5 qualifying matches in the Major 4 qualifiers, and that means that we only have 3 weeks of online Call of Duty left for this season, EWC preparation notwithstanding. And starting on May 2nd, Friday, May 2nd, we are kicking it off with a bang, right? Atlanta FaZe versus the Vancouver Surge, a rematch of the winner's bracket round 1 match from Major 3 that Atlanta lost. I'm going to go with Vancouver. I believe that there's just, as far as like online and on land, we've seen that Vancouver has the ability to beat FaZe, and I just saw it a week ago, so I'm certainly, or right now, I've seen it 3 or 4 days ago, so I'm going to go with Vancouver.
Yep. And I said earlier in the show, Atlanta have lost their first qualifier match of every stage before this one. So I'm going to pick Atlanta and just assume that they aren't going to go 0-4 in their opening qualifiers for all four uh, sets of matches there. But yeah, like you said, can't go wrong with picking Vancouver here when we literally just saw them win against Atlanta. But I got a feeling Atlanta might be able to pull this one out, but definitely can very easily see Vancouver taking this.
Next match is Carolina versus Toronto. I'm going to go with Toronto, but I think we should mention that it's not entirely sure what's going to happen with this Ultra roster. Something that we talked about a little bit yesterday was the fact that Beans did not play at Major 3 due to a visa issue. That would not preclude him from playing in these qualifiers, but Major 4 is taking place in Dallas at DreamHack. So if he can't get that sorted by Major 4 time, would they want him to even play in the qualifiers, or would they go to Mercules or some other substitute and try to finish out the regular season like that? So again, we don't know, but I'm going to go with the Ultra nonetheless.
Yeah, that's a problem with our scheduling issues for the end of this week. We're doing these predictions on Monday, April 28th. So even for this next match coming up, there could be some roster changes that we haven't foreseen or talked about when we're doing these predictions. But as of now, I got to pick Toronto, regardless of who their fourth is against Carolina. I do think clean slate for this new Carolina team with Rex in the picture now. They don't have to. Well, I maybe they play LAT again, but right now they get a shot to. Don't have to play 2 consecutive matches against LAT with their new player. So I'm excited to see what Dylan Rex can do against a different squad here, but I am going to go with Toronto.
And the final match on Friday is Vegas versus C9. I mean, if C9 has any shot at making champs, this is a match that they probably need to win. This is certainly one of the easiest, if not the easiest match that they have left this season. So if they don't win this, then I think just logically you're thinking they're not going to be able to pull off some miraculous run over the next 4 weeks. I'm going to go with C9. Obviously, Vegas has only beaten one team once, and C9 is not that team. So I'll go with Cloud9.
Give me Vegas, baby. I'm here for the chaos. I think, like we heard about the alleged secret tryout for Capsule in place of Attach before or earlier, a couple weeks ago, before the qualifiers, I believe, for Major 3. So I think it's possible that Cloud9 could make a roster change over these next couple of days. I'm not totally convinced. I think at this point they might just ride it out. But if they were already considering a move before this top 12 finish at Major 3, and I do think it is kind of unfortunate the way the bracket worked out for Cloud9 at Major 3. We didn't really mention that. Like they were playing Atlanta or Vancouver, regardless of who lost that first match. Like that, they just got the short end of the stick in terms of where the teams dropped down from the bracket. They still lost, but yeah, I think I don't know for sure what Cloud9's roster is going to look like for this match. I could very easily see them making a change. I could also see them sticking it out. And with that in mind, I'm going to go with Vegas here, thinking, Vegas might be in the mood to play spoiler.
Yeah, for sure. Saturday, May 3rd, the first match is Minnesota versus Vegas. I'm going to go with a rocker, obviously. I just picked C9, and I think the rocker is about the same as C9, if not a little bit better.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Minnesota here. I think I'm still high on this Minnesota team's potential, and if they want to really make that push and make the race for the last champ spot very competitive and stressful for the Green Wall, it starts with a big win here. So give me Minnesota.
Next up, Carolina versus Boston. Man, I want to pick my Boston Breach Boys, but I think it'll be Carolina. I think it's kind of like either way, it's kind of hard to pick. We just haven't seen very much of the Carolina team, and like I think I'm being clouded a little bit because I'm so negative on the Royal Ravens at this moment. And that's just because what we've seen of this Rex version, it's like they've stunk. And I don't think that's a reflection on Rex or even the team. It's just like what you said a few episodes ago. It's like you're pretty much just ignoring what happens in the final qualifying match and what happens at Major 3 because, Carolina is, trying to figure it out in hopes that it pays dividends at Major 4 and at Champ. So I'll go with the Royal Ravens, but yeah, I could see this going either way.
Yeah, I was totally expecting you to pick Boston, so I was going to pick Carolina, but now I'm going to just role reversal it, and I'm going to go with Boston. This is, we covered it earlier in the season, the revenge match between Snoopy and Slasher, and last time around it went in Snoopy's favor, and I picked Carolina, so this time I'll go with Boston. I was picking against Boston these past couple weeks, and it's definitely hurt me in the pick 'em, so I'll throw him a bone here.
Vancouver versus OpTic, obviously going with the Surge.
Yeah, gotta go Vancouver. Obviously, again, looking at that race for the last spot for champs on this Saturday, we got Minnesota versus Vegas and Vancouver versus OpTic. If those matches go the way we think they could go there, then that difference between OpTic and Minnesota drops to only 20 points. So these are big matches. It's a tough first match for Vancouver, it's a tough draw for OpTic having to play Vancouver in their first match of these qualifiers. But yeah, at this point, got to go with Vancouver.
And LAT versus Miami finishes out on Saturday. As much as Miami, we praise them and as good as they've been, I just can't pick against LAT, so I'll go with the Thieves.
LAT 3-0'd Miami in the winners bracket of this past major just a couple days ago, so gotta go LAT here.
Sunday, May 4th, Miami plays the other LA team. I'm more comfortable picking the Heretics here, so I will go with the Heretics over LAG.
Yep, same.
C9 versus Toronto, gonna go with Toronto.
Me too.
And Atlanta versus LAT to finish out the weekend. So Atlanta starts the weekend with Vancouver. They end the weekend with LAT. Unfortunately, I think this might be another moment where Atlanta begins the qualifiers with consecutive losses. I think they probably will start 0-2 if I have to guess.
Wow.
And I will go with LAT.
I'm going with LAT too here, but that's part of the reason why I am picking Atlanta in the first match against Vancouver. Although Vancouver has had their number, I find it really it's again two very tough matches for Atlanta, literally against the other two top teams in the league. But it would feel weird to me seeing Atlanta be 0-2 after a week of qualifiers, just like literally at the start of the season when they went 0-3 before the winter break. I'm just having a hard time picturing that. So I'm going to go with LAT for this match, but that's part of my reasoning for picking Atlanta over Vancouver earlier in the week.
And that does it for the pick'em. We didn't talk about it on the last pod, but I went 13-5 at Major 3 in the pick'em. You went 11-7. Before the major, we were tied, so that gives me a 2-match advantage now. I'm 125-65 on the season, and you are 123-67 on the season. I don't know what the win percentage is on that, but it's pretty good. We've done relatively well over the past few weeks. So we will. I did go like 10-0 one week, which certainly helped me. And you've been picking against Boston and somebody else, I think, that has really helped my cause.
I was picking a lot of Minnesota to win and Boston to lose, and that was a bad combination lately.
Yeah, especially since Boston went 4-1 in the qualifiers and Minnesota started in the losers bracket. So that does it for this week's show. This week's doubleheader, basically. We will be back sometime next week. Like I said on yesterday's pod, Bink is going out of town this week. I'm going out of town this weekend. So we won't have a traditional show on Sunday evening like we've been doing mostly. But we'll still be back sometime next week to talk about week 1 of the Major 4 qualifiers. If we get any roster change news, if Snoopy was lying, maybe we'll get some confirmation on that.
Snoopy.
Not Snoopy. Snoopy has never lied. He's been a good angel, serving my Boston breach over the last 2 years. If Shotzzy is lying, then we will be able to get some confirmation on that. But yeah, please follow, subscribe the podcast feed, and that's probably the best way to keep up with it. Is if you follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening on, or if you're on YouTube or on Twitch. If you subscribe, follow, whatever, that will certainly help you find out when our next show is. It'll be sometime next week, but the day, the time, the place, I don't even know if that is confirmed yet. But we will be back to talk about week 1 next week. In the meantime, you can follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers, and the podcast tours at Ego Chall Podcast. Subscribe to that YouTube channel. It was 222 subscribers yesterday, which was awesome to see. We've gotten a few comments lately talking about how much they like the show. I think shout out to Ryan in the YouTube chat today. He said, love the pod. Keep doing y'all thing. So we really appreciate you, Ryan. We appreciate everybody like you who's made some really nice comments about how much you guys like the pod over this season. And we just want you to continue to enjoy it. So if you have any feedback, any constructive criticism, please let us know, and we can kind of include that in the pod. You can also follow Bink on Twitch, right? Twitch.tv/jbink with 2Ks. And yeah, we'll be back next week. Until then, Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys for all the support. Shout out Ryan. Like Preston said, I usually like to do it at the end here. You stole my bit, but regardless, we both greatly appreciate all the support everyone's been showing lately. And yeah, a little bit of a funky schedule from us right now with the back-to-back episodes and on uncertainty around when we'll be live again. But we will be live again some point within the next week to cover these matches. And yeah, like we just said, 3 more weeks of online Call of Duty, then it's Major 4 champs and EWC, and the 2025 season is over. So we're going to be here to cover it. Hopefully you guys are enjoying the season so far, and the best action and the most high stakes games of the season are still to come. So looking forward to covering all that stuff for you guys, and we'll see you again whenever we go live again. So thank you guys as always, and remember,